covered a lot of information, and we are going to touch upon these other requirements. And please be assured that in the compliance checklist that we talked about this morning, these topics are covered. So you have that tool. I always want to remind you, you have your compliance checklist, your self-review. So you have a reference to go back to. So, and also your important dates. Remember, you have your important dates that things need to be done. And you have your glossary of terms that are used in the school meals program. So other requirements include on-site reviews, civil rights, USDA foods, meal service agreements. For those of you that still have funding from supply chain assistance, we're going to touch upon that and talk about record retention. So I'm going to touch upon briefly these topics and what you need to know. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to talk about attachment I, on-site reviews. And once again, I'm going to refer you back to that forms and resources, as I mentioned this morning, and we have continued to mention that is where you will be looking for those forms and attachments that you use the most. And you will find attachment I, on-site reviews. And so what is an on-site review? It is completed by an SFA with more than one feeding site. So if you are a school district or a sponsor with multiple feeding sites, you are required to do on-site reviews every school year. If you are a sponsor with a single feeding site, so perhaps your building is K through 12, you are not required to do an on-site review. The reviews should be completed by the authorized representative or bookkeeper. It can be whoever the school has designated to complete the on-site review. This cannot, if you are a school that has a food service management company, this cannot be delegated to the food service management company. It needs to be completed by district staff, and it must conduct one review for all sites serving lunch and 50% of the sites serving breakfast. So it's actually going on site and completing the on-site review form. And this is required to ensure that the site is operating as stated in the site application. So keep that in mind. It's a requirement. It must be completed by February 1st. They must be completed if you have multiples by February 1st of 2025. So plenty of time. They can be completed in any month prior to February 1st. And they are retained on site. This is not documentation that you submit to nutrition services unless it is requested. And typically it would be requested as part of an administrative review, but it is a self-check for a district to ensure that it has an accurate point of service meal count. It's a meeting meal pattern. So it's a series of questions that just need to be answered. So a required form for sites with multiple feeding sites. So I wanted to mention that. It's also on your calendar when it needs to be completed by. And let's move to the next slide. Let's talk about civil rights. The "and justice for all" poster must be visible in the service area or in the dining area where students, children can view that poster. And the poster looks like the one on the slide. We have not received any new posters. So if you are using the posters that are dated 2019, 2022, those are all just fine. Don't worry about that they seem outdated. They just need to be up. And when I'm talking about the poster, I'm talking about the large size poster. So if you have smaller versions that you've printed off, it needs to be the legal size poster. And you can contact our office on our homepage if you need to request new posters. But make sure that the posters didn't get removed over the summer and that they are up and visible to students, and they need to be in every area where students eat. Okay, so if you are delivering meals to a preschool classroom, then the poster needs to be visible in that classroom. Civil rights annual training is required for all staff involved in the school meals program. So any level of administration on down to operations, annual civil rights training is required. And this is training specific to the school meals program. And under forms and resources, under civil rights, the topic civil rights, you will find that we have posted training. There's a PowerPoint with slides and a transcript, and also a training certificate for the documentation that staff have attended that training. So any staff that is involved in the school meals program has to have annual civil rights training. And please ensure that happens if you hire new staff during the school year that work in the school meals program. They need to have that civil rights training. There's also the Institute of Child Nutrition has another training that's available that requires enrollment. It's free training, and it has a certificate also, but we have nutrition services developed training that has the yellow highlight. So just ensure that everyone has been trained in annual civil rights. Back to school is a good time to get that training done. And as I said, if new staff are hired, then they also need to obtain that training. So let's move to the next slide. Let's talk about the non-discrimination statement. The full statement is to the right, and it is also in your handout packet after the on-site review form. So we have the complete non-discrimination statement, and it is in the box. For non-public SFAs, guidance on updated non-discrimination statement that was issued in 2022 does allow for religious exemptions because some new wordage was added to the non-discrimination statement, which was including gender identity and sexual orientation. And for our non-publics, they have an exemption not to include that in their non-discrimination statement. So wanted to point that out. That was kind of a controversial topic, and I think it's still being decided in the courts. But this statement is very important because on the next slide, it must be included in program information provided to households. So that includes the free and reduced price meal application, and our application includes it, the approval denial letter. So if you are using an approval that is generated from your software system, it needs to look like our approval letter, and it needs to have the non-discrimination statement. So ensure that that is happening. It's on the notice of change in benefit letter. Information that the SFA posts on their website and any literature provided about the program must include the non-discrimination statement. The full statement must be included in the student handbook at the end of the section that addresses the lunch program. And this is something I often see when I'm looking at student handbooks, is that there's a non-discrimination statement, but it's not this particular non-discrimination statement. And this is the one that needs to be included in the section where you address participation in the school meals program. So as you update your handbooks for distribution, ensure that this full statement has been included in the section that addresses the school meals program. On menus, it's sufficient to have the one-line statement. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. So the one-line statement should appear on menus. And as we move on down, we want to talk about the USDA food program. Now, as I mentioned earlier today, that is a separate program, and it is administered through Health and Human Services, the Department of Health and Human Services, and USDA Foods provides entitlement dollars for the purchase of domestic agricultural food products in schools and institutions. So those entitlement dollars are based on participation in the program of the prior year. So, for example, schools have what I think of as like a bank account of entitlement dollars, and that can be used for the purchase of food items. And you need to ensure that those dollars are being used, because if you don't use them, you lose them. And we've included the website for USDA Foods, and you would need to reach out to the coordinator, Chad Moore, or Brian Gerkensmeyer, to make sure that if you are the new bookkeeper, that your information in their system has been updated so you are receiving notifications. So I encourage you to make sure that happens prior to school starting. They can walk you through the process, and they can also answer any questions you may have about the utilization of USDA foods in your school district. We've included that contact information in your handout packet so that you have it. And once again, I really need to emphasize that is a separate program. We work in conjunction with each other, but they administer the USDA Foods program. And Chad and Brian would be more than happy to help you. And then we want to talk about, on the next slide, meal service agreements. We have many of our SFAs that have an agreement with another SFA to provide meals. And we have updated our meal service agreement, and it is available on our website as well as in your handout packet. And as I look at the handout packet and I scroll to the bottom, it's on page 140. of your handout packet. It looks a lot different than it used to, but it really does spell out the responsibilities of the recipient school, the school getting the meals, and the school that is providing the meals. And so this is a form that would need to be completed. And when we talked about your application packet, this would appear in the checklist summary and would need to be uploaded into the checklist summary if you are a school that is receiving meals from another school. You have a meal agreement in place. So that's included in your handout packet. And then let's look at supply chain assistance funds. Now, for those of you that are new, you may not even know what supply chain assistance funds, but it was wonderful funding that was provided to school districts that sponsors SFAs that chose to opt in to receive the funding. It wasn't automatic. SFAs had to reply and want to receive the funding, and it was provided by the Commodity Credit Corporation, and it was to help with the supply chain disruption that was felt during the pandemic and after the pandemic, when SFAs had a hard time of getting food products. It was additional revenue that was provided to school districts, and it had very minimal requirements for its use. It had to be used for minimally processed food items or unprocessed food items. And the only responsibility of SFAs was to track the spend down of these funds used for the purchase of those non-processed or minimally processed food items. So tracking the spend down, and then maintaining the documentation of food items purchased utilizing this funding. So yeah, there's no timeline for the spend down. So if you are an SFA that still has that funding and have not used it all, you still need to be tracking the spend down. And I received a call earlier today asking me if there was going to be a 5th round of funding for the next school year, and I do not know. We've had 4 rounds of that additional funding, and I do not know if it will continue. But we do need to take care of the funding that was received to ensure that the documentation is in place for the spend down of those funds. And the funding was received by SFAs, and it cannot be utilized by a food service management company operating in an SFA. The funding is directed to the SFA. It was not provided to food service management companies operating in districts. So let's go to the next slide and talk about record retention. I'm sure many of you are, if you're new, you're walking into a new office space and you're seeing lots of files and you're wondering, what do I have to keep? Well, record retention for the school meals program is 3 years plus the current school year. So our current school year starting July 1st is 24-25. And so you would be keeping all records pertaining to the claim for reimbursement. That includes applications, students' eligibility, claims, direct certification lists, anything that pertains to the reimbursement that your district or your SFA has received. That also includes production records that are kept by your food service director, menus, those have to be retained for those 3 years plus the current. So anything older than 21-20 school year can be discarded. So we're looking at discarding 20 to 19 school year 19 to 20 can be discarded. But you have to retain, and they need to be, you're missing 22, 23. I am. Thank you. Geez, you're so good. I appreciate that. You're right. We are missing 22, 23. So let's look at those 3 years. We've got 23, 24. We've got 23, 22 and 22, 21. Great news. Anything older than school year 2021 can be discarded. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Okay, we'll come back to questions in just a bit. And you need to confirm with your software provider the process to ensure backup can be provided. So we have found that some software systems erase data from the previous year when they start a new school year. And if you have such software as that, then you need to have a backup of previous years. And so if that needs to be downloaded and saved, then you need to be doing that before new information is entered into your software system for school year 24-25. So please ensure that you have that backup information. Record retention requires that backup. And so records older than, I think we said 22, 21 can be discarded unless the SFA has a longer record retention policy. So the federal rule is 3 years plus the current, but your district may have a longer record retention. So check with your district to ensure that you're not tossing something you shouldn't be, or properly disposing of it. And just a reminder, records are the property of the SFA and must be readily retrievable. I know that we've talked about saving copies of letters, copies of applications, and you know, as long as those are readily retrievable, if you want to scan them and save them, just make sure that there's a backup, because there have been situations. I can remember 2 situations that happened recently where districts, schools have had ransomware and held their information hostage and did not have that information. And that was super unfortunate. But in these days, it's not that unlikely to think that there's bad people out there wanting information. So just make sure that you have a backup system for anything that you need to retain in regards to the 3 years plus the current year retention. So let's move to the next slide. And we're not going to go through these other requirements because there's more information on each of these topics on the Nutrition Services website. Setting meal prices, paid lunch equity. By now, probably most school districts have set their paid meal prices and have either used the paid lunch equity tool in helping determine that, or did not have to complete the tool based on having a positive balance in their school lunch account as of June 30th of 2022. Non-program foods, that's the pricing of a la carte foods and adult meals. Once again, we mentioned that we'd be sending out information about the pricing of adult meals once the free and reduced rates of reimbursement have been released by USDA. Every SFA is required to have a charge policy that has a pricing program. And that may pertain also to our CEP schools, where they are allowing students to purchase a la carte items. What is your local charge policy? So that is a requirement. It's not a new requirement, and it needs to be a policy that's enforced. And so there's information on our website about that. The school wellness policy, it's a USDA requirement, and it's not particularly just to the school meals program. We're looking at the school's wellness policy on what they are doing for children at the SFA. There's professional standards and hiring standards that pertain to food service staff. Requirements for procurement. The school meals program is a heavily regulated program, and there are rules and regs on procurement that have to be followed. And then the Buy American provision, which falls under procurement. More information on our website about that, which is also a USDA requirement in regard to the purchase of food in meal service. So lots of more topics. We just don't have time today to cover everything. But as I said, it's on your checklist, your compliance checklist, and also more information is available on our website.